I'm Mayor Tommy Roberts. Welcome back to the Mayor's Table. In the state of New Mexico, we just recently completed the 2017 New Mexico legislative session. And this morning, I'm fortunate to have with me as guests two local members of the state legislature. We have Representative Rod Montoya, who is the House Minority Whip, and we have Senator Steve Neville, who is the ranking member, Republican ranking member on the Senate Finance Committee. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's good to have both of you with us this morning. I think our viewers always find it interesting to learn a little bit about the legislative session each year. Not too long ago, we had Senator Neville with us to talk about the session going into it. It was a pre-session segment on the Mayor's Table. And I think our viewers will be very interested to learn a little bit more in detail about what happened during the session. So this morning, just simply want to get from each of you your perspective about what happened in the legislative session. We do know that it's likely that we'll have a special session called, and we'll want to have your thoughts about a special session where we are going forward. So let's start with you, Rod. Just tell us what happened in the House this year. What was the process like? I know that it was a tough session for both of you. Anyone who serves in the legislature has a tough job to do, and it's probably getting harder and harder to do. But let's talk about this session. And Rod, what was your experience this time?
Well, Mayor, it was a little bit of a filling out period there for a while. We went from long-time Democrat leadership. 2 years ago, the Republicans, or sorry, 3 years ago, the Republicans took over the House, and then it went back to Democrat control. And so initially, there was nothing set in stone. We didn't know our counterparts, new leadership, both in the House and the Senate. Rather than the long-time members who had very solid reputations as to what to expect, this was brand new. We also went in with a budget deficit that for the current fiscal year. So we were front-loaded with a special session, quite frankly, at the very beginning to shore up the budget deficit from 2017. So that all happened right at the beginning, caused, at least on the House side, I think things are much more adversarial, and I think both sides knew that the only place where there was going to be any real possibility for the governor to get strong, sustainable margins to uphold vetoes is on the House side. So lines were drawn pretty quickly, and it was 60 days of a very adversarial relationship in the House between Republicans and Democrats, and that's how it started out. It ended that way as well, and quite frankly, a very progressive leadership as compared to the old North Central, just liberal Democrats that had run things for years. The very strong move to the left on everything from funding items to social issues. It was a very leftward turn in the House, which quite frankly we fought the whole time. But as we all know, we ended the session with a budget that was out of balance, combined with a massive tax increase to somehow for the Democrats to be able to say this is a balanced budget, which it really wasn't. It was a out of balance budget with a large tax increase to cover what was out of balance.
Before we talk about some of the details in the budgeting process and some of the challenges there, Steve, I'd like to know what it was like from your perspective on the Senate side during the session.
Well, by far, this was the most difficult session I've been. This was my 13th session, and it was the hardest one I've ever had anything to do with. And of course, prior to that, I was 8 years on the county commission, and I observed from the balcony for many years. And certainly, this was the most contentious, most difficult session I think that's happened in New Mexico in a long time. It was money. We were, as Rod said, we were broke the day we got there, and we were $70 million in the hole. And we had to figure out how to balance that. We were able to come up with some things. We found some underutilized funds that from agencies and so forth that we could sweep. We found different ways that we could move money around, but we were able to fill that hole, and the governor accepted most of that. And we ended up fixing the 2017 fiscal year, which ends this June. We were able to fix that, and actually our revenues have started coming in a little stronger than what we anticipated, so it looks like we're going to finish the year in the black, even though there's some concern that maybe we won't have enough money. I think we probably will be okay for this current fiscal year. Now, the next fiscal year, Rod's right, we had a lot of disagreement on how to do it. The atmosphere in the Senate and the House are diametrically different. It's a whole different culture in our side of the building than it is in their side. And we are vastly outnumbered from a political standpoint. We're 16 to 26, so we don't accomplish much by being difficult to deal with. You know, we have to negotiate and work one-on-one, and it tends to be, and there's other things. We're on 4-year terms, they're on 2-year terms, so their politics is much more upfront than ours. It's a different culture, and we just have to work a little different way in the Senate than they do in the House to accomplish the same things.
So the challenge this session was to close this projected revenue shortfall, and I think going into session it was estimated to be about $290 million for the next fiscal year, for this coming fiscal year. But you first had to deal with the current fiscal year. You did that in the first couple of weeks, and then the rest of the session was dealing with the ensuing budget year. Each chamber of the legislature deals with that separately in the process, and then you have to come together and through some kind of consensus developing format and process, you have to send something to the governor. So talk briefly about the process on each side of the legislature. Rod, what did you come up with that you had to then negotiate with the Senate?
Well, Mayor, the problem this year was, quite frankly, on our side, was we don't control the process anymore, which was a little different. Two previous years, we were able to control the process. We knew when we started negotiating what we would be able to get to the other side. As to what we were trying to get to was something that both former Republican House member Tom Taylor, former mayor, formerly held my position, and Senator Scherer, concept that they came up with was to redo the entire revenue streams coming into the coffers. So a tax overhaul is what we made our focus. Obviously, there's going to have to be some revenue increases in the short term, but because of the oil and gas situation as it's hit San Juan County particularly hard, as a state, it was a glaring problem for us. So we look at this as having to fix our tax system to be a reliable income stream rather than increasing all of our expenditures just because oil and gas is up, which is what the other side likes to do. Every dime that comes in, they want to spend it. There's no saving for a rainy day. So we're looking at this as, since it's critical and it's something we're going to have to fix, we decided to draw a line in the sand that if we have to do something, let's fix the system. And that's what we've been negotiating for this entire time, and what we're still holding on to, why we upheld the governor's vetoes, is because we want to make sure if we're going to go in and raise taxes, let's try and make this be the last time. Let's get something to where it's a positive revenue source, but is more fair, more equal. In the end, we're hoping to be able to drop the capital gains tax down substantially. We're hoping dropping it down 1.5% to 2%, and that not down to that, but down that much, down to the 6% range, which we would also in that probably have to reinstitute the food tax, at least at the local level. That would make it a reliable source for the cities in particular. Once again, everything that we're looking at is unpopular. But if we're going to have to do this, let's get it in a place where we don't have to mess with it anymore, where the cities can count on what they're going to get, rather than hold harmless in this process will probably go away completely. It's been a problem for the state, it's been a problem for the cities, it's been a problem for the counties. If we can get back to just stable revenues, something you can count on, that helps us, that helps you, and keep us in the future from having to raise taxes every time the roller coaster of oil and gas prices go up and down.
So the major focus in the House was major tax reform, focusing on the gross receipts tax system in New Mexico. That was probably embodied in Representative Harper's bill. I always like to refer to it as the 347-page bill. I always also maintain that I could draft the fix in 2 pages, but I probably couldn't, But at any rate, that was the focus. In the Senate, Steve, what direction did the Senate take?
The infamous bill that you got to pass it to understand it, or whatever
Right.
Representative Pelosi said. Well, what has happened to us is that through time in the last couple of decades, we've had lots of oil and gas revenues, and it's been natural, I guess, with all of those tax revenues coming in, to try to move the burden off of certain groups and so forth, because you have all this spare money and what we've done, there's 2 things that I think that have made a big problem with our budget. And the first is that we did away with the food tax, state and local tax, back in 2003 or somewhere in there. Four. And that is a $200-300 million number. It's a big number for the state. Then the other thing that has happened is about 2-3 years ago, I guess, the governor did the expanded Medicaid, and Medicaid will approach about $200 million before it's all said and done. When you take those 2 factors, and we've expanded Medicaid in general, when you take those 2 factors and you start looking at the budget, then when you have a downturn in oil and gas on top of it, it has created a very, very serious problem with balancing the budget. Those are the 2 biggest things. We've done other things, but those are the 2 biggest hits to the budget that we've undertaken. Not that they're bad, not that they're not justified in some fashion. We needed to do something about health care, and we certainly, to the degree you can, you don't like to tax food, but the realities are our whole tax structure was built on a certain format, and when you start tinkering around with it, there's ramifications that go way beyond where you think they're going, and that's what's happened to us.
And so ultimately, a bill was delivered to the governor, and she vetoed significant portions of it. I think that bill had 4 or 5 major components to it. Can you describe, Steve, those major components in that bill?
The base budget, the spending budget, was fairly close to what the governor's proposed budget was as far as spending, but it didn't accommodate her goals as far as the revenue side. She had different ways she wanted to accomplish that. We had fixed the education from when it came from the House always starts the budget, comes to Senate. And there were some things the governor didn't like. We fixed those with education and some other factors. There were some things that were in there that I know she could have line itemed, but she chose to do some pretty draconian things in terms of the universities. She vetoed the entire budget for all universities. And I'm getting concerns expressed by the universities that they're having trouble recruiting students. You've got an athlete or a scholarship recipient from Texas, and they've heard that the university's not funded, and they want to go to UNM or New Mexico State, and all of a sudden they realize the university doesn't have any money, and they don't even know, in theory, you don't even know if the university's going to open their doors next year. And that, in reality, that's not going to happen, and we know that. But if you're an out-of-state student, or if you're even a student in Las Vegas, New Mexico, you may not understand how all this works, and you may be concerned about where you get another choice to go to Texas Tech. You may say, well, I'm not sure what's going on. I'm going to go to Texas Tech. So I know Gary Carruthers, who's a San Juan County native, just called me a few days ago, and he's very concerned about some of his students who are expressing concerns about coming to a New Mexico school.
So the governor not only vetoed the funding in the bill for higher education, she vetoed the funding in the bill for the legislature. She also didn't like about $350 million of new revenue. And
Now, that was a separate bill.
a separate
But she
bill.
did veto the whole
She
bill.
she vetoed that. And so there were some good things in the bill that went to her. I think probably all would agree. I liked the attention given to internet sales taxation, taxing internet transactions. I think that creates a level playing field for local brick and mortar Main Street type retail places.
Yeah, our thought was that she would take parts of that bill. She vetoed the whole thing, but the thoughts were that she would take the internet tax portion. She would take. There was a medical portion in there that generated, I think, $80 million for the state, and between those two, that came close to balancing the budget. Not any reserves, but it came close to doing that. And then we figured we probably would have a special session to come in and try to figure out the other reserve portion and do something. But we thought she'd take parts of it and not veto the whole thing. She fooled us and vetoed the whole thing.
As a result of the veto, the Legislative Council has filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the veto, specifically, among other things, claiming that it's unconstitutional for her to line item veto or veto funding for another branch of government, the legislative branch. Also, fundamentally unconstitutional to veto entire funding of higher education.
Right.
I understand that hearing has been set for May 15th at the Supreme Court of the State of New Mexico. But I understand that both of you think that that hearing might be too late, that it may be necessary for something to be done on a statewide budget.
I think it may even be purposeful to push it out that far, knowing that there's pressures on us to get that done. It puts the Supreme Court in a very difficult position because the question is the constitutionality of the two major portions of funding that were vetoed, as you mentioned, the legislature's budget and the higher ed, the complete higher ed budget. But the question then is, does the Supreme Court then reinstitute all of that, thus creating a budget that's out of balance, which is also unconstitutional? So,
and that leads us into the discussion I think that I wanted to pursue, and that is the consequence of the Supreme Court decision. So, Rod, you're telling us that if the Supreme Court ruled that the vetoes were unconstitutional, then we would have a budget. It would not be a balanced budget. That would be unconstitutional in and of itself, and so you've got another problem. If the court ruled against the Legislative Council and found the vetoes to be constitutional, you're still going back into a special session to create a budget that the governor will accept. So, what's the next step, in your opinion, Steve?
Well, we've certainly, one of the things that the Leg Council, I'm not on Leg Council, that's the organization that runs the legislature, the leadership of the legislature. They made a decision to start the process for an extraordinary session. I think that's premature. Personally, I don't think we need to do that until the governor decides whether she's going to call one or not. When the governor calls a special session, what she does is she says, I want to consider these issues, A, B, C, and D. And I've got 2, 3, or 4 things she wants to consider. It's restricted to what she puts on the call, is what we call it is the call. The call might say we want to cut salaries of state employees by 10%. Well, that might be enough to balance the budget, but it's not something that would pass. So the legislature could then use the authority to go into extraordinary session. We sign 57 or 58% of the legislature has to sign off and says we want to go and call ourselves into session. Then we can consider anything we want. So we could put together a process. I think at some point, if the governor's proposals were not acceptable or couldn't be passed, I think that would be the time that we would want to do that. But there are processes we can get to that we could get the legislature back in session and pass bills. You can always override vetoes. That's another option too.
Do either of you have any strong opinion about what the budget that's ultimately submitted to the governor and ultimately adopted by the governor, what will it look like? Do either of you have a strong opinion?
Well, I personally think it'll be pretty close to what came out of the legislature in general. I think the university funding will be back in. The legislature's funding was relatively small, but it's key. We can't function without a legislative council, which is our attorneys, our finance guys that help us draft the budget, all those kind of things. We have to have those committees. They can be reduced or they can be cut, but we can't function without those committees, those staffs in place that serve our committees. So we've got to have those things. We've got to have the universities funded. So in form or fashion, I think those things will come back in. Now, how we fund that, that's the real question. Are we going to cut some other areas of state government? Are we going to reduce the universities 20%? I mean, there are lots of things, options out there. We can reduce the whole budget. We can cut money out of it. We can raise taxes. We may come up with something the governor would be agreeable to, and possibly under this restructure process that Rod was talking about, where we redo the whole tax structure in large part. There may be ways that we would increase revenues in the short run, and at the same time get a new system in that would be fair and more balanced and better, less dependent on oil and gas, those kind of goals.
There's been a fair amount of agreement on some of the particulars. Internet sales tax is a fairness issue. I think the governor even is calling it that. The hospitals concerned, all of the hospitals across the state that are nonprofits, because that's an area where there's probably going to be some increase. The particulars of it, there's a wide range of how to get that done, but to some degree that's probably going to be in there. There's a argument. The governor also vetoed all of the capital gains, which is about $63 million. There's some discussion and negotiations, I'm sure, will be on that, whether or not that's part of the fix, because that in the end doesn't end up in a tax increase or a cut to something else. There are several tax increases that are on the table, including food, including some sort of a gas tax. There's all kinds of things on the table. For negotiation purposes, it all has to be on the table. There's something more popular with certain members and less popular with others, and that's on both sides. So, as a matter of fact, I would imagine that's probably why the governor vetoed the entire tax bill rather than picking some of the things that it keeps in place the urgency. The urgency will probably lead to the best opportunity for reform rather than just increases. So I think that was the purpose of it. I think it puts the governor, at least in her mind, in the strongest negotiating position.
I'm sympathetic with those who are concerned about this process playing out over too long a period. We're in the midst of our budget-making process, and we are concerned that the outcome may be adverse or detrimental to municipalities in some way. We don't know exactly what that might look like, but we're always concerned about the treatment of the hold harmless protection that we currently have.
Right.
It's being phased out, but it is still protection. And so we're concerned about the possibility that some money might be found by eliminating the hold harmless payments altogether without some way to recover that lost funding. That would be a crisis for local government, relying on these hold harmless protections.
And we've worked very hard to try to get the culture changed in the legislature to prevent just that. So whether we've got it 100% or not, we've worked a lot on key legislators, to try to get that philosophy ingrained so that everybody understands that counties and cities can't function just by a wholesale elimination of the process.
Well, Rod and Steve, I think that's about all the time we have this morning.
Great.
We could talk a long time about this, and we could give our viewers a lot more detail. But I think this morning we've done a pretty good job of giving the overview and the highlights. I'd probably like to have one or both of you back after the special session is concluded,
Sure.
and then talk about the result and how that's going to impact citizens in San Juan County. Do either of you have anything you'd like to add before we close?
No, it's just going to be it's a tough year, and we hope everybody understands that it's a very, very difficult process. Everything that we do affects somebody, and there's no decision or process we can do that doesn't have ramifications on some group or some individual that are not necessarily positive. And we try to avoid that to the degree you can, but you can't be 100%.
We all appreciate the difficulty of that job. I think sometimes we think that at the local level, where we're face to face with our constituents, we have a tough job, but I can't imagine the magnitude of the problems that you experience at the state level and legislatively with all of the different worldviews and philosophies. So I very much do appreciate your efforts on behalf of the city of Farmington and the citizens of San Juan County. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to thank all of you for joining us here this morning on the Mayor's Table. We'll look forward to seeing you again next Monday.